Well, we are currently in the book of Genesis, and we are in our covenantal continuity section of Genesis, where we see the covenant that was made with Abraham continuing on into the next generation, specifically into Isaac. And so we saw that already kind of begin, and now this morning in Genesis 25, we're going to see even more of that play out. You know, last week we saw the determination before Abraham died, as he was nearing the end of his life. We saw him give a commission to his oldest servant, his longtime servant who he trusted, to go and find a wife for Isaac. And we saw the way the Lord orchestrated the events, that he would know exactly who this woman was that the Lord had prepared for Isaac. And he made it abundantly clear by answering the prayers of Abraham's servant, and it was Rebekah, this young, hardworking woman who comes out and cares for the needs of Abraham's servant and all of his belongings, all of his camels. We saw that, right? This compassionate woman caring for him. And then we saw the way that the Lord led Rebekah then back home to eventually be married to Isaac. And so we're going to see kind of the continuation of that. We're going to see the end of Abraham's journey today, a little snapshot of Ishmael, and then jumping into Isaac with the next generation after him within the covenant. So what we'll see specifically, God's faithfulness to Abraham continues on. All right, so recognize that God's faithfulness to Abraham continues on. It didn't just end when Abraham passed on, when Abraham moved from this life. It didn't end there. God's faithfulness within the covenant of Abraham that he established there, he continues in the next generation, into Isaac, the child of promise. We also see that God's plans are not bound by our human limitations. We've got limitations. All of us do. And we see those, and oftentimes they annoy us, they aggravate us, they bother us, but God's plans are not bound by our limitations. All right? And we see that in the text this morning, that human limitations do not keep God's plans from happening. He cannot be thwarted. And finally, in hardship, perspective determines responses. So recognize that when we are faced with hard things in this life, our perspective will determine how we respond to those hard things that we are faced with. And we're actually going to see two specific instances with two different responses as hardships arise in this text this morning. So with that said, let's jump right into Genesis 25, starting in verse 1. It says, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Letushim, and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Henach, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Now, how many of you could have listed those names off, right off the top of your head, right off the bat? I see that hand. Yeah, right. These are not names that we're like, oh yeah, I know that name. I've heard. I'm super familiar with those names. But if you say Abraham or you say Isaac, you say names like that, you're going to know those names. So why are these names mentioned? Well, these names are mentioned because even though they're not the children of promise, this is still a part of Abraham's story. And these are still children that are born to him through Keturah. And so as we consider that idea, there were, I'm not going to go into a bunch of details on this. Some people think this marriage with Keturah happened before Sarai, or during his marriage to Sarah. Others think it happened after she passed away. It's not a huge rabbit trail to chase down, but the reality is, my conviction would be based on this text, that he's likely marrying her after Sarah passes, which means he was at least 137 if that is the case. And so people are like, how could this old man have more kids? That'd be more miraculous than his child with Sarah. I don't agree with that. Sarah was barren and beyond the childbearing ages for women, right? So regardless, he's married her and he has additional kids with this wife. So we see these are the kids that he has there, and all these were children of Keturah. Now Abraham, verse 5, gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts. And while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, eastward to the east country. So he's sending them away. They're heading east as he sent them away. Now, he doesn't send them away empty-handed. He gives them gifts. And as you know, Abraham was an incredibly wealthy man. I'm sure those gifts were to set them up well. But all that he had, his entire life's desire was to give to Isaac, right? This is his desire, to honor the Lord, and the Lord had given him Isaac, the child of promise, through his wife Sarah. So all these other children that he had, he sends them away, and his covenant promises of the Lord had given him, he knows. The Lord made it clear that those are going to come through Isaac. So Isaac is the one that he gave all things to. And he sent the rest of them away from Isaac. And it says, these are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. Now, if you remember back when the covenant was established, we see in Genesis 12 the calling of Abraham. We see in Genesis 15 the covenant establishment there. And look at this. This is one of the promises made to Abraham at that time. As for you, shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. So right here, even in Abraham's death, the timing of it, God is faithful to his promises. Right? He lives to be 175 years old. I was thinking about that. His midlife crisis would have been at like 87 and a half, right? That's middle of his life. That's a long time to be alive. And the Lord made that promise to him, and the Lord made good on his promise. Surprise, surprise, the Lord fulfills his promises, right? We've seen that time and again. Here he is fulfilling another promise. He gives Abraham all that, and then he's an old man full of years. The Lord continued to bless him all that time. The Lord's blessing was upon Abraham throughout his entire life. And remember, he had Isaac at age 100. So now Isaac would be 75 years old by the time Abraham passes on. And now we see here at that time, Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai Roi. Now, if we're not careful, we could overlook a very important portion there. In verse 11, God blessed Isaac, his son. So after the death of Abraham, God chose to intentionally, deliberately bless Isaac. So God's blessing was upon Isaac. And just as we saw, when God blessed Abraham, my goodness, that man had blessing upon blessing, right, in his life. No doubt about it. Doesn't mean that there were never hardships, though, that he faced, right? At one time, there was a famine that came about, and he had to travel into Egypt. And then in Egypt, he made some decisions to be deceitful, which didn't play out so well. And then in the end, he was still blessed despite that, right? We saw that happen. There were hard things that he faced. How about many years where this promise lingered from the Lord that he would have a child through Sarah, and it didn't happen. So he sought his own means, right? We saw all this with Abraham, but he was blessed all along. Now Isaac is also blessed, and we're going to see in his life it wasn't without its share of hardship as well. But God blessed Isaac, his son. So we see God's continued blessing through the line, through the child of promise. I find it interesting, too, Isaac and Ishmael together. If you remember earlier on in the book of Genesis, when Isaac had been weaned and they celebrated him, they had this big celebration, Ishmael was found laughing at him, right, in a mocking manner. And so Hagar and Ishmael were sent away at that time. With that being the case, somehow, at least for this point, Isaac and Ishmael come to bury him. Not the other kids with Keturah. They're not mentioned here. It doesn't mean they weren't present there. I would imagine they were probably present there, although maybe not. He had sent them away, so maybe not. But in this case, we see Isaac and Ishmael coming together, at least for this moment. His sons, they buried him in the very cave that he had purchased. We just went over that a couple weeks ago, where he purchased this cave in the land of promise to bury his wife, and ultimately where he would be laid to rest as well. Now, this Isaac settling at Beer Lahai Roi, if you remember, we saw that in the text last week. He was going out to meditate in the evening and returning from Beer Lahai Roi. And again, as I said last week, there's a question mark there because we're not 100% sure that that's the exact location, but it's very likely it's in that area. And remember, this is where that well was for Hagar. Hagar was in agony. She had fled from her mistress. She'd fled from Sarah because of the harsh treatment she was experiencing. And as she was along her way, the Lord came to her here. And so this is the well of the living one who sees. That's what that means. Be'er Lahai Roi. And so at the well of Hagar in that regard, this is where Isaac has chosen to settle down after Abraham had passed. Now it jumps and it says, these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, named in the order of their birth. Great. Another list of names that I won't pronounce right. That's all right. We'll go for it. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedema. Kedema. I'm sure that's the right pronunciation, no doubt. Regardless, here we have these sons born to Ishmael. And here's what it says. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their encampments, 12 princes or rulers according to their tribes. And so part of the reason why this is so significant is that these are going to become their own people. Each of these tribes, just like the Israelites end up being a nation of 12 tribes, but a singular people group in that regard, this is going to happen from Ishmael. And remember what happened in Genesis 17. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, because Abraham said, oh, that Ishmael might stand before you, his son, that he might stand before the Lord. And the Lord says, as for Ishmael, I have heard you, Abraham. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. So here we see another fulfillment of God's promises in our text here. This is something that was said years and years earlier, right, prior to this time, and yet here it is outlined in the text. This is what happened. Ishmael then, as he grew, had 12 sons. And it says, these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. He breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. Notice, gathered to his people, not buried with Abraham and Sarah, because that was reserved for the child of promise. That was reserved for the family that had been, the covenant promise was given to and continued on through from generation to generation. Since Ishmael was not the child of promise, but was the child of the flesh, he doesn't benefit from, he benefits from being in the household of Abraham, but he doesn't reap the full totality of God's great promises through his covenanted people. So they settled from Havilah to Shur, which is opposite Egypt in the direction of Assyria. He settled over against all his kinsmen. And if you remember right, when the prophecies were made about him, he would be a wild donkey of a man and set against his brothers. And so here's the text saying he settled over against all his kinsmen. This is very likely in the region when it says opposite Egypt, it's in reference to the Holy Land. So opposite Egypt would be southeast as opposed to the southwest area of Egypt. This is likely where they then would have been settling in that region. And these would be the people that would grow to become the Arabic peoples. And so we see this then, there was enmity throughout the Israelite history with the Ishmaelites, any of the descendants from Ishmael, and the Israelites. It's very clear that this was happening, that he was, that he was kind of set against his brothers. And here it says he settled over against all his kinsmen in that regard. And so this is actually the last glimpse we see of Ishmael specifically in the text throughout the book of Genesis. And then it goes into the child of promise. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And this is seeming familiar. Now he's married to a barren woman. And Sarai, who turned into Sarah, was also a barren woman. So now why is this happening? Why do these men that God has chosen continue to marry these women who remain barren? What's going on with this? I think it's all about the Lord drawing their hearts to him and him getting all the glory. That's what it's about. Because if she was able to conceive by natural means and she was super fruitful in that regard, then it'd be easy to credit that to her. But instead, with this being the child of promise, having his own children, and by the way, this isn't the only place where you're going to see this pattern. This is a continual pattern throughout the covenant, that the women could not conceive, and yet God was not bound by the limitations of natural humanity, of natural means like that. God came in this case. So Isaac prays to the Lord for his wife. He was 40 when he took her to marry her. That's old. Even at that time, that was old to be married. Particularly at that time, that was old. The average age, most likely for men to marry, was around 18 at that point, and women was even younger. So for him to get married at 40, he's already older than most by getting married then. And now his wife can't have children. She's barren. So Isaac's response is to pray to the Lord for his wife. He goes to the Lord on behalf of his wife, also knowing who the Lord is, remember we saw already he was meditating as a part of what his father had trained him up to do. He was seeking the Lord in this way, and now he's praying to the Lord for his wife. He's asking for the Lord to intervene, for the Lord to come and enable his wife to bear children. And as he prays to the Lord, again, remember, he got married at 40. Keep that in mind as the text continues. You're going to see this. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. Genesis 21:12. Remember this, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And so we know that when God made the promise to Abraham, it was going to be through Isaac's line. And so here's Isaac with his wife, and she can't have kids, much like Abraham was unable to have kids with Sarah. What's going to happen? Well, here's the promise, and Isaac would know this. Isaac, I'm sure Abraham would have made it abundantly clear what the Lord had communicated to him. So through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Well, now is the covenant in jeopardy? Like, is this not going to happen? Granted, most of us know how this is going to end, right? This is not the end of the story. But as he prays to the Lord for his wife, he has this, I know he would know this. He'd have this in mind. He's the child of promise. But he's praying fervently for his wife. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Verse 21, there's a gap between that first sentence and that second sentence. All right? And you're going to see how long that gap is as we continue in this text. It looks, as we read this, we think, he prayed, the Lord answered, poof, baby. It's not what happened. He prayed. And then he prayed. And the years went on, and he kept praying. More years went on. He prayed. Then a decade passes. He's praying for the Lord to do this. He doesn't give up hope. He keeps praying, knowing that the Lord is faithful and trusting in the Lord. It wasn't just 1 decade. 2 decades have passed. The children struggled together within her. So she's pregnant now with these children struggling. And she said, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. So she gets pregnant, and at this time they weren't going for their weekly checkups and getting, ultrasounds to see that it's twins. And so the discovery that she has 2 in her, she's trying to figure out what is going on. There's like fighting already in her womb. Inside of her womb, she sensed that there's a struggle going on, which is why she asks, if it is thus, why is this happening to me? If I'm pregnant, I'm finally pregnant, what is going on in here? She went to inquire of the Lord, and how the Lord speaks to her in this regard. I love that. I love that her thought isn't like, I'm going to try and go get some diviners in the air. I'm not going to go to this wisdom of this world. She inquires of the Lord. And the Lord makes this really prophetic statement. There's 2 nations in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one will be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. That's flipping things on its head. That is not culturally how things go. The oldest, the firstborn, is always the one who inherits everything, really. They are the primary child, the one whom the name will continue through, the one whom, the homestead goes to, all this stuff. And now he's saying, no, the older shall serve the younger. And as you think about this, recognize the Lord's saying this while these babies are still in utero. They are in her womb, inside of her. They haven't done anything outside of the womb for the Lord to say, yeah, I'm pleased with this one. I'm displeased with that one. You know what I'm saying? They haven't come out of the womb and lived in such a way that it's determined on them. It's just by God's sovereign choosing. The older shall serve the younger. And that's backwards from the world's line of thinking. That's not the way human flourishing tends to happen in this time. That's unusual. And yet God's saying, no, I know this is what you expect, but I'm telling you, the older shall serve the younger. That's going to be really significant. Because again, God is doing things in a way that humankind wouldn't do. That's not the order in which they would do it, but God's going to get the glory by doing it His way. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. We saw that already in the text, right? The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So remember, as I said before, they got married at 40. His wife's barren. He's praying for his wife. 20 years after they get married, she finally gives birth to these boys, to the red hairy man and the deceiver. which is really what that means. So Esau means like hair. It's to do with the hair, and he comes out completely hairy. And so they call his name Esau. And the reality is, as we see throughout his life into adulthood, he's a hairy dude. And like he continues being hairy to the point where when Isaac's on his deathbed, we will see there's a distinction between how he feels on his arms and back of his neck and how his brother feels. So you got hairy, Esau, and his brother, deceiver, Jacob, because grab the heel was, he literally grabbed the heel, so they named him Jacob. And what's amazing is you're going to see how that man, that baby boy grabbing the heel, deceiver, Jacob, the heel is what Jacob really means, but it's the grabbing of the heel. It was a word for deceiver. We will see his deceptive works in his life. And yet, the younger, right, the older shall serve the younger, even though he's a deceiver. And we're going to get into all that craziness as we continue on. But for now, it says this: when the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So you have two completely different personalities, different skill sets. One's better out in the field as a hunter, and Isaac loved or preferred or favored Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved or favored or preferred Jacob. All right, so how many of you want to admit to which kid's your favorite in the household? Right, that's what I thought, right? We don't play favorites. We certainly should not play favorites, and we should all love our kids all the same, even though there may be some moments where one kid drives you a little more nuts than the other kid, and then the next moment, it's the other kid driving you a little more. Maybe I'm the only one who's had that experience. I guess I'm more depraved than the rest of you. But the reality is, I don't love one child more than the other. And with my parents, I know I was their favorite, but beyond that, most parents, just kidding, most parents, we love our kids, right? And it doesn't matter. Maybe one has more of our personality trait, and maybe the other has our spouse's personality traits, or whatever the case may be. But it doesn't change how much we love each of our kids, right? And yet we see that this favoritism, this special love for one versus the other with parents, this is going to continue to have implications and a ripple effect down the road. And we see this not only in their relationship, but actually think about when Jacob gets married and how you have Leah and you have Rachel, and one he loves more than the other, and how that's a real healthy dynamic for a household too, right? So we see that this is happening. And what I do love about this, as I've said before, the scriptural text gives us so many details that show how imperfect these people are, right? These are not perfect, polished people that God is using. He's choosing broken people just like us to display his glory. That should be a comfort to all of us. And so we see some of the brokenness in this. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, now we get to a real specific story, Esau came in from the field and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Anyone else ever have a nickname that sticks with you from a specific story, specific incident? My sister and multiple cousins still call me Matman because when I was about 3 years old, I'd watch the old Adam West Batman program. You know, it goes, na 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 na. No, it says Matman. Come on, guys. And I insisted it was Matman. So now my sister, I'm not even joking, we're in our upper 30s now, and if she calls her, I call her, "Hey, Matman." I'm like, "Hey, Shell Bell, how's it going?" So she has a nickname too, right? So we've got these nicknames that sometimes stick for life. In this case, this one incident now essentially results in Esau being identified as Edom, which means red. And Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright now." So Esau's exhausted. He's been in the fields hunting and trying to prepare this food. I could just see Jacob in there, apron on, working in the stove, whatever. It's not quite like that. But Jacob's in the tent. He's prepared this stew, and his brother comes in. "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I'm exhausted." And by the way, the red stew is likely from lentils, which can have a reddish hue to them. So that actually does make sense to call it a red stew. But it's this stew is there, and Jacob says, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? What's the big deal about this? I'm going to die if I don't get this stew. So what good does this birthright do me?" Right? Keep this in mind, that in his desperation, this is This is where he's at, right? Also, it's pretty sneaky of Jacob to be like, sell me your birthright. If you, you want some of my stew? Oh, it's delicious. Yeah, you want some of this? Yeah, I'll give it to you for the low, low price of your birthright. It's a loving brother, right? And by the way, we see enmity from brother to brother, from Cain and Abel on, right? Ever since the fall, we see this happen. So here's enmity. Yeah, sure, you can have some stew. It'll only cost you this. Your birthright. I'm about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? Esau's elusive answer. So Jacob said, swear to me now. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Now that sounds, I don't know, when you read that at face value, that may sound a bit harsh, man. Like, he despised his birthright? Well, he's just hungry. He said he was starving. He's going to die if he doesn't eat. But Jacob gives him these things, and this text is very specific. He ate and drank and rose and went his way, giving no thought to the birthright. What was the birthright? Well, the birthright was the promise of God from Abraham through Isaac. And the birthright then would have gone, like we said, naturally to the oldest, the firstborn son in that regard. He gave up the promise of God, the covenant. Now we know ultimately the Lord is over all things, and the Lord's not going to be, oh, shoot, that was my plan. Now I got to go to plan B. No, God's plan is going to come to fruition just as he's determined. But Esau despises the birthright. He has no interest in the things of God. That's what we see this is indicating. And if you're not sure of that based on this text, look at what the author of Hebrews tells us. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. That no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. For you know that afterward, when he desired to inherit the blessing, he was rejected, for he found no chance to repent, though he sought it with tears. You think about that context. So Esau despising his birthright, I mean, that's included in the list of sexual immorality and those who are causing trouble becoming defiled. It's not just I'm super hungry, so here, man, you take Dad's kind words to you. No, it was a rejection of the things of God to him. That's why this is such a serious offense. And afterward, as we see at the end of Isaac's life, when there's a blessing given, and we see Jacob and his mother working and conspiring a little bit there to, not a little bit, completely, in order to inherit the blessing for himself, we see Esau desperately yearning for the blessing of the Lord through his dad. He can't get it because he's denied it here because he sold his birthright for a single meal. He despised the things of God at that time. So as we consider this, let's look again. Here's a reminder of what we've seen today. God's faithfulness to Abraham continues on. As it says, God blessed Isaac. And we see the covenant continuing on through Isaac. Now it says also that God's plans aren't bound by human limitations, whether that's infertility, whether that's birth order, whether that's any number of means. God's plans are not bound by them, nor will they be stopped by them or thwarted by them. God's plans will persist no matter what kind of human limitations might exist in any circumstance. Next, in hardship, perspective determines responses. In fact, we see today two different responses in hard times. We see Isaac prays to the Lord for Rebekah's womb, right? He's faced with kind of at a crossroads. That'd be a challenge to my faith. If I knew, man, the Lord had promised this to my father. He's made this covenant to my father, and I saw him faithfully interact with my dad. I saw that. And then I know that I'm the child of promise because my dad made that abundantly clear to me time and again. And yet, my wife can't have kids. And yet he persists in prayer. And then the other response to hard times, Esau is hungry, desperately hungry, and he sells his birthright to Jacob for a meal, for a single meal. And so the reality is we can choose to fervently seek the Lord in hard times, just like we see Isaac do for 20 years, seeking the Lord on behalf of his wife, seeking the Lord for his blessing in that regard. We can choose to fervently seek the Lord too, or we can reject the Lord in pursuit of the world. And I know that might sound harsh because we think, man, Esau was dying. If I'm dying, I think, what good is a birthright, right? Like as he says, what good is anything else? But the reality is that he wasn't actually dying or starving. He was just famished after a day in the field. Doesn't mean that, hey, he's feeling great. But the reality is he was pursuing relief for his hunger rather than hungering and thirsting after righteousness, right? That's what it comes down to. He was more concerned about his needs and his desires in this life, in this world, than he was for the eternal blessings of the Lord. And so we can either choose to fervently seek the Lord when we're faced with hard times, or we can reject the Lord in pursuit of the world. Desperation drives us toward God, or we let it lead us away from and reject God. Think about that. When we are desperate in our lives, it's going to do one of two things. It's either going to lead us to trust in the Lord all the more and to lean on Him and say, Lord, I am desperate. Maybe I'm desperate for food. Maybe I'm desperate for deliverance from this bondage to my sin. I'm desperate. Whatever I'm desperate for, it's either going to drive me to go to the Lord in desperation, or it's going to cause me to push away from the Lord, reject the Lord, possibly blame the Lord. Where were you, Lord? Why aren't you here for me? This is awful. I'm in the worst circumstances of my entire life. Where did you go? I guess you abandoned me. If you've abandoned me, I'm going to walk away, because what's the point? And we can do this because we cop an attitude with our Lord. And praise the Lord, He's merciful and He doesn't strike us dead in an instant for our questioning. He meets us in our weaknesses and He gives us grace and mercy even when we are belligerent with attitudes like that. But recognize that desperation will lead us to do desperate things. And either we become desperate and seek after the Lord, or we become desperate and we reject the Lord, and ultimately we face the consequences for that. And the difference is all in our perspective. Do we maintain an eternal perspective in these things, or are we so overcome by temporal circumstances that whatever eternal ramifications there may be, I just don't care. I just need to meet this need right now. Are we too temporally minded so that we're driven away from the Lord to try and find our own solutions to these problems? Or instead, do we turn in desperation and say, Lord, I don't know, maybe I don't know what's happening. I don't know how this is going to ultimately play out, but I need you. I need you to sustain me through this. I need you to do a work in my heart in the midst of this, or to do a work in someone else's heart while I strive to love them better, or while I seek their forgiveness for what I've done wrong. Whatever it may be, when we are desperate, our perspective will determine our response. And our response will always be one of two things. We draw near to the Lord, or we push away from the Lord when we're truly desperate.